Princeton Recuerdos interview, Friday, July 2nd, 2021. Good morning, Marcia. We're about to kick off. Please state your name, spell your name, and your class affiliation.
Marcia Gonzales-Kimbrough, class of 1975. It's spelled M-A-R-C-I-A, Gonzales, G-O-N-Z-A-L-E-S, Kimbrough, K-I-M-B-R-O-U-G-H.
Thank you. Thank you for your time today, Marcia. We're going to begin the interview in several sections. We'll provide you a series of ideas to keep you on track, but feel free to go in any direction you like. Our first section is going to focus on your life prior to Princeton. Please set the stage and tell us briefly about your life prior to arriving to the university. You can talk about whether you attended public or private school. You can talk a little bit about your family. Did you feel properly prepared? And why did you go to Princeton or some areas?
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you, everybody that has been involved with this project. It was a brainchild of Ricardo de Leon about 5 years ago. ALPA has been an incredible force in my life and in the university's own life. And Juana and Margaret, you all have been great. ALPA's board, I applaud you, I applaud you. So my life, I am sixth generation Northern New Mexican. I grew up right outside of Taos, New Mexico, which is about 40 miles south of the Colorado border. It's a rural farming community, but also art, long history of art culture. We have the Taos Pueblo, which is a UNESCO site. It's a World Heritage Site. I grew up tricultural. Probably about 70% of the residents of the whole county were Latino, about 20, maybe 10% Native American, and 20% Anglo white. And let's see, I am, as I said, I'm sixth generation Northern New Mexican. My ancestors that we can trace back the furthest would be my great-grandmother's grandfather, who actually came from Italy as a 14-year-old boy with his uncle, who was a Catholic priest, and they were coming, of course, to New Mexico and northern Mexico, southern New Mexico, northern Mexico. The priest had been assigned to convert the American Indians in that area. Long story. It'll take too much time, but it's a fascinating story about how the 14-year-old ended up being in northern New Mexico. He set up the first grist mill in northern New Mexico for people to grind their wheat and their corn into flour. He traded a lot with the American Indians. We know a lot about that history because my great-grandmother, who lived until she was, I believe, 93 years old, she knew him and grew up with him, was actually raised by her grandfather and her father because her mother passed away early. So she just had such rich history. And I actually learned a lot of that history in a class that I took at Princeton that we had to do an oral family history project. Let's see, high school, well, school. I went first grade through eighth grade to St. Joseph Catholic High School. And it was, small parochial school. And then we had a high school, but in my eighth grade, the high school closed for lack of enrollment. So I was forced to go to public school. My parents were not happy about that. And really neither was I, because although all of my friends were going with me, I liked the environment of Catholic education in a smaller school. So 9th through 12th grade, I went to Taos High School. There were probably about 250 students per grade level. I think for a rural school, it was actually a really, really good school. Number one, most of the teachers were Latino, so we had great role models, folks who related to us. There was no indication of disparate treatment, discrimination. Many of the teachers had been my parents' teachers, so it was multi-generational education. The drawbacks were, late 60s, that school, the only foreign language it offered was Spanish, and probably, 70% of the students were bilingual. They offered 4 years of high school math, but there was no pre-calculus or calculus. The highest level, the fourth year level, was advanced algebra and I think trigonometry. So, and I was a really good student. I was, very, although my parents did not go to college, they actually dropped out because my mother got pregnant with me, and they were in a committed relationship, even though they were very young. So they got married, I was born, and they always, it was a given. They never preached to us. It was just a given that we would all finish high school and go to college. I have I have 3 sisters and 2 brothers, and all of us have been to some level of college. My parents they had a small sand and gravel business in northern New Mexico. And so they provided raw materials to construction projects, mostly roads. But it was still lower middle class. But the wealth disparity growing up was not anywhere near where I felt that there were rich people and there were poor people. There were folks that were on aid, and had stamps to go grocery shopping, but everybody basically had a garden, had maybe some chickens. So really, I felt I was quite privileged. Why did I go to Princeton? I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. Heaven knows why I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. I didn't know any doctors. I remember watching Dr. Marcus Welby on television, and I thought it was really cool to be a country doctor, but no idea what the study of getting ready to go to medical school academically would be. My college counselor suggested in my junior year that I apply to a summer program at Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire. There had been a student the year before me that went to the summer school, and my counselor thought, great idea, would get me used to being away from home. And I got accepted, scholarship. I went. That was an incredible experience. First time I really ever interacted with African Americans, foreign students, folks from New England. And they had a college fair, and Princeton was there. And a friend of mine that I had befriended at Exeter, he didn't drag me, but he said, really come to this college fair. And I went, and he had gone to Lawrenceville summer school the prior summer. He said, Princeton's gorgeous, it's great. And this is before the internet. So all you had was a brochure and a course catalog to make your decisions. And he was applying to Princeton and Yale, and we talked, and we were kind of boyfriend, girlfriend, but not really. So I did not like the information I had heard or got about Yale. So I applied to Radcliffe and to Princeton. Although Harvard had gone co-ed, you still had to apply as a woman. You still had to apply to Radcliffe. And lo and behold, so I applied to New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, University of New Mexico, and Princeton. And I got into Princeton. Well, I got into all of them. And now I have to make the decision. Well, Princeton was full financial aid. So, and, it was getting away. My parents were not, weren't wild about the idea, but they also didn't at all discourage me. They really were, you need to make your own path and, make get the best educational foundation so that you can be successful in life. So that's how I went to Princeton. Was there something else on that series of questions?
Margaret, you can take it away now.
Okay, great. No, I think we're going to move on to the next chapter, which is life at Princeton. So we have a few questions about this too. And again, just reiterating Juana's recommendation, suggestion that if you want to go off in any sort of certain direction, that is entirely your prerogative to do. Okay, so what a great story about applying to Princeton. Can you try to take us back to when you were just about to go? What were your expectations going into Princeton? Did Princeton live up to them? And what were your initial impressions?
Oh my God. You know, without the internet, I really, I knew nothing about Princeton except that it was a world-class university. So I did not know the difference between a research university, I kind of knew about PhDs and I kind of knew about masters because, some of my teachers had master's degrees, but I had no real depth of knowledge about the comparison of universities. I just knew it was a really good school. I thought it was in New England. I really did think that New Jersey was part of New England. So I really didn't have expectations other than that I knew I was going to a place that had, great academic reputation, and that was that I would be exposed to people from all parts of the country and all parts of the world, and that I'd be in a different geographic area and I'd have to grow and mature in a way that would be really, really different because I was so far away than going, for example, to UNM or New Mexico Tech, which, we're 2.5 to 4 miles away from home. So when I got to Princeton, let's see, flying into Newark was only the third time I had ever been on a plane. The first 2 times were going over and back to Exeter, to Boston, and then going on to Exeter Academy in the summer school. I'd never taken a city bus. I'd never taken a train. My supplies, or whatever you call my bedding, my posters of Taos, my photographs, those my mom had I'm not sure how she found out from the university that the best way to get them to Princeton was not to bring them in your suitcase, but to ship them via train. And that there was a delivery service from Princeton Junction that would bring them right to your dorm. So we drove to the train station outside of Santa Fe. And we had driven before I left, and shipped my stuff. So when I got on campus, it was already in my, I don't remember if it was in my dorm room or at the bottom of the entryway. I got on campus and I was mesmerized by the beauty of the campus. I had seen some photos, but I had no concept of what green, what that color of green of ivy really is, and just all of the greenery around Princeton. I was blown away because Taos is sort of high desert, although we're 7,000 plus in elevation, and the mountains go up to about 14,000. It's not the same green and lushness of Princeton. Got on campus, went to my dorm room at Blair Hall. I had a quad. My roommates were from North Carolina, from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, Bethesda, Maryland, but she had grown up in, I think, Austria. And my other roommate was from Long Island. Very friendly. I was kind of overwhelmed and just taking it all in, and wasn't quite lonely yet, wasn't quite homesick yet. But that afternoon or that evening, I hear music coming out from outside of, I think I was on the second floor of Blair Hall, that entryway, and I hear music coming, live music coming from outside the window. I looked out those gorgeous bay windows that those old dorms have at Princeton, and there I'm being serenaded with Las Mañanitas by Larry Garcia, who is now Manuel Garcia y Griego, class of 73, and Joe Schubert, who's class of 74. They're both from Albuquerque, both Chicanos. Oh, by the way, I was the first Mexican-American woman to go to Princeton, which is a distinction in itself. But of course, Princeton had only gone co-ed a couple of years before I applied. But in any case, well, I also think they had a quota for admitting women under 5 feet tall, because I'm only 4'10". But anyway, they must have been somehow impressed with whatever I wrote about in my application. So I got in, and there I am, first day, and Larry, I still call him Larry, Manuel Garcia Grego and Joe Schubert are serenading me, welcoming me to campus. And I thought, okay, this is going to be a really good experience. They became incredible big brothers, supporters, mentors, reminiscers. And transitioning to Princeton, the most difficult part of it was that I had grown up seeing 4 generations of my family almost every single day. I saw my great grandparents because that's where the bus stop was. And then we'd have to walk about a mile to our house. Weekends after Mass, it was always going to one of my grandparents' house, and all my aunts and uncles and cousins would get together after Mass and have whatever it was, bizcochitos, freshly made tortillas. And I really missed that multi-generational experience while on campus. It rained for 10 days. It started raining about the 4th day on campus. It rained for 10 days. Now I'm from, high desert, never owned an umbrella. Nobody in our whole family owned an umbrella. It rained so much that the water was no longer seeping, draining into anything. The grass was wet, the dirt was wet, saturated. And I thought, is this what the weather is going to be like in New Mexico? It's the fall and the aspens have changed colors, and then the next thing in New Mexico we'll have snow. But I was a little concerned about that rain. I didn't have rain boots, didn't have an umbrella, quickly went to Nassau or the U store and Nassau Street or the U store and bought an umbrella. The next challenge that I had while I was there is, since I had, been a declared pre-med, and what they did is they just assigned a pre-med advisor to you to help you choose your courses and someone to go to in case you had questions about planning out your whole, the curriculum that you're gonna register for. And I was really struggling in calculus. I hadn't had calculus in high school, and I'm in Calculus 101 with students that are from the Bronx School of Science and Math that, have had, 2 years of calculus already. And I was really struggling, like flunking out, struggling. Within those first 10 days that you can drop classes, talking to my pre-med advisor, he said, well, yes, you're not prepared for entry-level calculus. What if you go to Princeton High School and take high school calculus at the high school, and then come back and in your sophomore year, start with calculus? But unfortunately, calculus was a prerequisite for a lot of the other pre-med classes. So that really would have put me about a year behind. And, nobody was doing 5 years in undergraduate school. When I was in school, everybody was either dropping out or they graduated in 4 years. And I just talked to myself, and okay, if I'm struggling so much with calculus, am I going to struggle so much academically with all of the other courses that are going to get harder and harder, like organic chemistry? And am I going to end up graduating with a GPA that will not make me competitive for medical school? And it's like, I didn't really know. I didn't know the specifics, I guess, of what the study of medicine was going to be like. I think when I was a freshman on campus was the first time I realized that you're going to be in school through medical school, for another, 6 years or so after. So I happened to have seen an advertisement on one of the posts that are, in those days, there wasn't, again, advertising through the internet, but there were posts, polls throughout campus where people would, nail up advertisements. And there was an advertisement for a research assistant in the psychology department. And I interviewed. It happened to be with the professor that was my freshman psychology professor. And he hired me as a research assistant. That really helped ease the academic angst. And it also gave me a sense of I had a future, because I really liked the psychology course. And I felt like, okay, I'm going to be able to find a career that I will be happy in. Let's see, what else? Did I feel like I fit in? Well, I mean, Larry and Joe, went a long way toward helping me feel welcomed. And I'll wait to see if you ask questions then about things like the Third World Center.
Thank you, Marcia. And your stories are pretty amazing. They ring true to us as well. Many of what you described, I think we all experience. So thank you for sharing those. I'm really, I want to focus on the fact as the first Mexican-American woman to attend Princeton, you addressed some of the challenges. Tell us a little bit more about the welcoming side of your peers and your professors and how they helped in the adjustment. Any mentors you found along the way, some positive stories along those lines, like the Mañanita story.
Well, Princeton in many ways was kind of ahead of its time in helping first-gen low-income students of color have a support base. And one of the things that they did when I was there as a freshman, and I think they had done for about 2 years before me, is they asked folks in the administration if they wanted to be kind of like volunteer surrogate families, if they wanted to host a student and just be around for the students to drop in the administrator's office and just talk, or maybe invite the students over for a family dinner in their homes. And I was so lucky. I certainly took advantage of that. I wanted to meet people in the administration, and I was paired with Bill Weathersby, with William Weathersby, who was the vice president for, I think they called it vice president for communications and external affairs, or something like that. But anyway, he was in public relations. He and his wife Ruth were so incredibly supportive, welcoming. They had a son and a daughter that were a few years older than me, and they had another daughter who was still at home. I think she was a sophomore when I met them. They lived right outside campus. They would invite me over to dinner. Mr. Weathersby had been the under ambassador to India under John F. Kennedy's presidential administration. And so they were always visiting folks from Tibet, India, places probably in China, but just people that had been involved in the foreign service. And they would always try to have food that was typical of the country that those folks were coming from. And so I got exposed to, well, I guess now in Japanese culture, they call it shabu shabu. In Los Angeles, we call it hot pot, but it's kind of like a fondue meal, but it's not a dessert. It's a boiling, bubbling broth that you put really thinly sliced meats into, with a skewer and vegetables, and then you end up with this, wonderful mixture of flavors. Mrs. Weathersby was a real student of pre-Columbian art. So she's the first one that took me to the Princeton Art Museum, the Art Museum, and walked me through some of their holdings, which actually at the time, and I think still, Princeton has a really good collection of pre-Columbian art. Let's see, what else helped? So it was the Weathersbys. Of course, my roommates actually were pretty supportive and a little worried about how homesick I was. There was no Latino food anywhere. There was no Puerto Rican, Cuban, no Mexican food anywhere in the whole Princeton area. In Heightstown, there was a Mexican restaurant, and my roommates, there was an upperclassman in the entryway right next to us in Blair Hall. And he was from Arizona, and he had a car on campus. So they convinced him to take us, the four roommates and him, to a little restaurant in Heightstown that I can't remember what it's called, but it had a little burrito. It's a ceramic burrito. statue outside with a serape, and they blindfolded me. They didn't tell me where they were taking me. They blindfolded me, put me in the car, and we get to this restaurant. We walk in, and it's cute, you know, very chintzy, decorated, very, very touristy. And but the gesture was absolutely precious. And the menu was, you know, your typical enchiladas, tacos, but I could see the kitchen. Everything was coming from a tin can. So the tamales, staff were opening a tin can, probably an El Paso brand, canned foods, and putting on a plate, or warming them, putting it on a plate. Again, the gesture was really wonderful, but the food was nowhere near authentic. But again, it was the compassion of my roommates that I really appreciated. And then very, very quickly into getting on campus. And it was again, Larry Garcia and Joe Schubert that invited me both to the Third World Center. And at that time, the Latino organization was known as ULA, Unión Latinoamericana. There were not enough Latinos on campus really for any of the ethnic Latino subgroups to have their own organization. It was, ULA was my family, my friends, my confidants, my folks that were involved in ULA and at the Third World Center are really why I didn't just survive at Princeton, but I actually think I thrived in many ways. Maybe not as academically successful, although, you know, I did okay, but socially, personal growth wise, becoming aware of other cultures, of other food. The Third World Center was the place that I felt the most comfortable. I felt the most free to express and explore. Express, you know, what I was going through, explore what other people were going through, and explore their cultures, their experiences. People that I met through the Third World Center are how I ended up going often to the Bronx with one of the other Latinas to visit. It's the first time I had Puerto Rican food. And out of that collaboration or that interaction with other people of color and professors, not that many professors of color, but there was one professor, Peter Wynn, who was in the Latin American Studies department, was always there, and he was kind of seen as also sort of as a big brother. The Drurys, I can't remember their name now, but they were in administration. They were African American. They were also sort of our aunts and uncles on campus. They were always accessible for us to go in and talk about whatever it is that we were going through or what successes we had experienced. With ULA, one of the activities that we did as a community service activity, which if you've read Sonia Sotomayor's book, she talks about it. We volunteered, the Latino students that were members of ULA volunteered at the New Jersey State Psychiatric Hospital. At that time, there were no professionals on their staff that spoke Spanish. They were having janitorial staff translate for the doctors, the psychiatrists, and the patients that were Spanish speaking. And so we volunteered, we did translation, we organized social, just social gatherings, social, not so much events, but social gatherings for the Latino the Latino patients. We did everything from bringing our own record player and albums and have dances. The women loved when we would do a nail polish, you know, we would do nail polish. The men loved playing dominoes with the Latino students. And we, of course, really liked being of service. Another thing that was really enriching for me is the Latinos and a few others that were Catholic. We would put on, I don't know if that's the right word, but we had our own mass, our own Catholic mass on Saturday evenings. I think it was in the basement of Chancellor Green, or maybe the basement of what used to be On Team Theater. I don't know if that's still there. And folks like Joe Schubert, Dolores Chavez, who was class of 74, Charlie Haig, class of 76, I think, Larry Garcia, everybody who knew how to play guitar, and Dolores Chavez has an incredible, incredible voice. They took it upon themselves to learn liturgical music, but that was sort of modern, kind of Herb Alpert, sort of Misa Bossa Nova kind of music. And we would have mass, and afterwards we would just, whatever it is, go to the student center for whatever, we were drinking coffee at the time. But that helped feed of course, the spiritual side of what we needed on campus. Let's see what else. Courses that were impactful. Do we want to get onto academics yet?
Well, yeah, but just to gauge, you mentioned some names, but quantify, like how many people were in your social group? How many were the Latino women? How many were the Latino men, or the Latinas and the Latinos and the group? How big was the group, and how did it fit within the entire university?
That's a really good question, Ricardo. I think, so I was the only Chicana in my class. There were, I think, 2 Chicanos and maybe 3 or 4 Puerto Ricans in my freshman class, men and women. Yeah, in total, I think throughout my 4 years on campus, I don't think there were more than 30 to 40 Latinos, in any one year across all four classes. So the numbers of Latinos was really, really small, but cohesive. And a few of the Latinos did go the eating club route, but most everybody socialized through the Third World Center. It was also, during the sort of, I don't know if you would say the height, but certainly the uptick of affirmative action on campus. And there was a lot of support for affirmative action amongst the white students, some of the faculty. Of course, there was a lot of interaction between the Latinos, the African Americans, who were the larger group, and of students, and the Asian Americans. Most of the Asians at that time came from lower to middle class, Chinatown in New York, Chinatown in San Francisco, and there were a few Native Americans. Actually, probably the 4 years that I was there, I think had the highest number of Native Americans that Princeton has ever had on campus. And we had Native Americans from California, New Mexico, I think South Dakota, the Upper Plains. And so there was a lot of camaraderie, collaboration. I didn't grow up in a community where we were super aware of or participated in protests and sit-ins and marches. Certainly had seen about it in the news coverage, and talk about it in school and classes that were discussing current affairs. Of course, it was during the Vietnam War also. So on campus, there was a lot of advocacy against the US involvement in the Vietnam War, lots of protest sit-ins, advocating for Princeton to divest itself from any interest in South America, which was seen as supporting apartheid. I'm trying to think of what were some of the other. The ROTC building had been burnt down either my freshman year or the year before. So there was some militancy on campus. In my freshman year, I was like overwhelmed and trying to deal with a whole lot of other stuff. And if I had been invited to a protest or a sit-in or something, I probably would have said no, because I would have been scared to death that I would have been arrested. And then my parents would fly use all their life savings, fly to come and get me and yank me out of Princeton. So, it was like I was being mellow. But in my own way, I think I became more actively involved in on-campus political issues. And I'll get to that in a couple of seconds. But I think the climate of acceptance of affirmative action at the time had a lot more support from the white students than in other eras. I personally, so the male-female, the student male to female ratio when I was on campus was 11-1, so 11 men for every 1 woman. I did not feel that, I never experienced any discrimination. I never heard of any disparaging remarks made by professors, by even other students, either about being a person of color or about being a woman. I do have to say that when I arrived on campus, got to Blair Hall, had to go to the bathroom the first time, go downstairs to the bathrooms that are, in the basement of Blair Hall, and there were 6 urinals and 2 toilets. The university had not quite grasped that the physical plant had to change, in order to accommodate women being in that particular entryway. That was about the only thing that struck me, that like, were they not ready for women yet? Yeah, there was just such, in my experience, I think the African-American students, and I heard them talk much more about having been the victims of just awful treatment. There was one story that, and I can't remember which of the halls it is, but there's an archway that joins, I guess that has a dorm above the archway, and that it was routine that whoever the white guys that were living in that suite would pour urine whenever on the African-American students, whenever they were walking under the archway. I was just fortunate that I didn't experience that personally. I certainly felt for any of the African-American students that were being targeted in that way, victimized in that way. In terms of, so the one sort of kind of racist or insensitive experience that I had, I don't know if when you all were there or even now, whether the university has something called student initiated seminars. So at that time in the early 70s, you could, as a student, organize a course to be offered that was not already offered in the catalog of courses. You had to get a petition, and I can't remember signed by how many students that would commit to sign up for the class. You had to get a faculty member that would be the sponsoring faculty member, and you had to design the syllabus and the curriculum. And so I think it was either at the end of my sophomore year or the first semester of my junior year, I proposed a Chicana history course. And there was a committee of faculty members that decided whether to approve or not approve the proposal for the student initiated seminar. So my proposal got rejected. And now I had Professor Peter Wynn as the sponsoring professor. I had the requisite number of students that had committed to take the class. And the rejection letter said that the course did not reach, the syllabus of the course did not reach the academic rigor of Princeton, which was really, really interesting, because that exact same course, exact same professor, exact same syllabus had been approved 2 years earlier when Manuel Garcia Grego had proposed it. I used everything that he had used. All I did was update a couple of the books in the reading list. And so that ultimately, so I'm not sure how it got to the Princetonian, the Daily Princetonian, but there was a story about it in the Daily Princetonian. And I think the university had an appeal process, or maybe they created an appeal process, or maybe I just was probably at Larry's edging, and his pushing me. I appealed, and it was ultimately approved. But it was again an example, I guess, of the university not being wholly committed to offering courses and ways of studying the history and the history of, certainly the history of Latinos. I think a couple of years after, or somewhere around the time that I was on Princeton, there was a course approved on Puerto Rican history. Ultimately, it was a great course. Another interesting course that actually changed or solidified what I did in my career was a course in the politics department that was called Blacks in the Law. It was not a very creative title, but it was basically a course studying major legal cases that were civil rights cases. And it was taught by a visiting professor from Howard University, and it was precepted by a graduate student, Bob Curvin, who is notorious in his own right. Bob Curvin, if you ever look at any archival footage of any of the media in Trenton, Bob was at that time a college student during the Trenton riots, photographed with a megaphone asking people to be nonviolent and to follow Dr. Martin Luther King's teachings and to protest, but not to be violent and stop the looting. Anyway, Bob Curvin was a graduate student at Princeton, and he precepted. The course was enlightening. It was light bulbs going off of like, oh, that sort of treatment. Even my parents had experienced discrimination, which I hadn't really thought about it, but I remember them saying that when they drove from New Mexico to Texas, I think it was might have been right outside of Dallas, to pick up some kind of construction equipment, they had definitely not been allowed to stay at certain hotels that had the signs, no Mexicans or dogs allowed. We're not allowed to go into certain restaurants. And so that course more realistically, I guess, pointed out the struggles beyond having taken the Chicana history course, but it was the shared experiences of African Americans in the U.S. and other communities of color. And fast forward, I was working in Los Angeles in 1992, and the LA riots happened after the Rodney King verdict. And, or the Rodney King, yeah, it was the verdict of the police officers that had beaten him up. And Bob Curvin at the time was the head of urban poverty funding for the Ford Foundation. And he somehow tracked me down. And at that time I was working on economic recovery after the riots in the communities that had been most impacted by the looting. And he said, I want you to give me a tour of Los Angeles from what really happened, and what was the real impact of the riots and the loot, and mostly the looting. Where was the economic impact? Not just geographically, but who was impacted by it. And so I toured him for about 2-3 days, and he commented to me that in that course, Blacks and the Law, he thought my contributions to the discussion were so insightful, articulate, and really added, and enriched the conversation. Now, mind you, I was always afraid to speak out in class. I always wondered, is my New Mexico accent going to come through? Am I going to have the right, fancy words to say? Did I really read and understand the reading material, or am I going to embarrass myself by making some comment that, makes it look like I didn't get it? So I was really struck when Bob told me that I had made valuable contributions to the class. Now I felt a lot more comfortable in my upper level psychology classes, because, just because I was an upperclassman. Now, shifting over to psychology and my thesis, my work study job as a research assistant in the psychology department, I ended up doing research for another cognitive psychology professor who became my senior thesis advisor. And we were doing research on information processing time reactions of the brain and how the brain processes accurately information based on shape, color, words versus alarms. And it was all research that was going into developing the cockpit for the space shuttle. NASA was using my professor's research to design the cockpit on whether the pilot would react faster and more accurately to a square button, a triangular button, a red button, a green button, a button with flashing stop or whatever. So we had human subjects that were students. We paid them, I can't remember, $5 probably for a 1 hour. They would come in and we would do reaction tests with them. My senior thesis advisor, Professor Nancy Frost, she took a sabbatical and was at UCLA my senior year. My junior year was, it was, I basically got paid to do my junior paper and my senior thesis because it was the research that I was a research assistant for. So my junior year, she was there to advise me. My senior year, she was gone. And so we would just meet over the phone periodically, but it was really 2 graduate students, her immediate graduate student, research assistant, that was pretty much my day-to-day advisor on my thesis. And then there was another African-American, she was, this other graduate student was a woman from Manhattan. And the other graduate student was African-American male, and they both really held my hand through the whole senior thesis process. The topic of my senior thesis was hemispheric bilateralization of the brain. It was in those days when nobody had computers. Nobody had PCs. The only computer were the gigantic mainframes that took up I don't know how many, half a room at the engineering quad. And so you would go and I don't even know how we did the key cards ourselves to analyze our data. And you would go and they wouldn't even let you feed the key cards or whatever those are called, the punch cards, through the machine. You had to hand it over, there's your stack, to a graduate student who would then interact with your cards in the machine, the mainframe, and then would spit out your data. Senior thesis was an incredibly important, growthful experience. It's you're totally in control of it. You've got to manage your time. You've got to plan ahead. You have to, whatever it is, hypothesize, do the data analysis, write it. And in those days, they were, what were they called? Manual typewriters. So you had to handwrite it out and do all of your editing and your drafts, because that was even before Selectric. So typewriters. So there was no way to erase and edit as you were typing. I remember sleeping in the research room overnight because of the time crunch in getting either my draft, I think it was my draft in, and I, basically just didn't want to take the time to walk back to my dorm and then walk back in the morning. And actually I was afraid that if I overslept in my dorm, I wouldn't get back to the psychology department in time to polish it off. Oh, and by the way, speaking about dorms, that would have been the psychology department going all the way across campus to the Spelman dorms. I was in the first group of students that resided in Spelman dorms.
Well,
So we had an apartment. Nobody else had like real apartments with a bathroom in their own suite.
it's crazy. Marcia, when you look back at your time at Princeton, how did it change your interactions with home? You made references to your parents and to your grandparents. When you were at Princeton, what were your interactions like to people back home, and how do you think they changed, or if they did?
Very, very good question. Anytime I was back home, my teachers always wanted me to come and talk to their students about college and about the experience. When I was in high school, if anybody, the furthest person I remember going away to college was a student in the year ahead of me went to Stanford. And, you know, I think at that time it was less than 20% of my class that went to college, my graduating class that went to college. So if people went to college, they went to UNM in Albuquerque, you know, 2.5 miles away. Maybe they went to Eastern New Mexico or Highlands University, that is in like Eastern New Mexico. It's in Las Vegas, New Mexico. But I knew no one that had or was going. Oh, I'm sorry, my best friend in high school went to Yale. So the two of us were the only ones that we knew that went to the East Coast to college. And because people knew me on campus and at Taos High School, because I was on the debate team, I was in the Model United Nations team. I don't think I was ever in student government, but you know, we did well. My partner and I, my friend who went to Yale, we were state champions in the debate team. And so, you know, there are trophies displayed in the entry level, in the entryway to the main part of the school, along with the basketball tournaments and the whatever other sports trophies. So I was asked to come back often to talk. Interestingly enough, some of my relatives, one of my father's brothers, one of my uncles, once commented that my language had changed and that I sounded hoity-toity and uppity. That was an interesting comment. Probably my vocabulary expanded at Princeton, and maybe I talked less, maybe a little bit more formally, but I certainly, you know, I didn't have an ego about having gone to college or to Princeton. My siblings, they just, you know, they loved me. They loved me coming home. They loved sharing their, you know, what they were going through when my brothers were first allowed to shoot a 22 and go hunting with my dad. They loved to tell me that. And so I did come back and work after my freshman year. I worked that summer at the Taos Municipal School District in their administration offices. So people in the community didn't feel like I was like abandoning the community, like I was going to be one of those folks that went away to college and never came back. So I would say that my relationship with family and Taos and the community really didn't change a whole lot. You know, my whole family was still very, very much local, involved in community service, involved in everything from the Sheriff's Posse, which was a service organization, to the Kiwanis Club, to, you know, supporting the local public library. So, you know, none of that really changed.
Thank you, Marcia. Final question, and thank you so much for everything you've shared today. It's very powerful hearing you speak and your experience. We truly love and appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. So if you could go back to your 17-year-old self, Marcia, about to start Princeton, what advice would you give her to ensure her success and happiness?
I would wanted to answer that question, and I will. But I want to have you indulge me because I have one final story that you have to let me tell, and it's about the bleeding suitcase.
Absolutely. Go for it.
Okay. So going back to 16-year-old girl, young lady. You know, in the years after I got out of law school and I moved to Los Angeles, I have always been, ever since then and to this day, I've always been involved in college fairs, career days, mentoring programs, mentoring high school students, college students, law students. And so what I try to tell them is, number one, we belong here. For me, I didn't have that struggle. I'm 6th generation New Mexican before my ancestors were here. way before all of the 50 states became states. I never had, luckily, I never had to experience a sense of being an immigrant. And so to the students that I have mentored and that I've spoken with, I talk about, be proud of your heritage. Your heritage is not your family wealth. Your heritage are the values that your family have instilled in you, or that you have developed on your own through your own resources. I would tell that 17-year-old girl, be prepared for Princeton. You've never really been allowed to date, and now you're going to an 11-to-1 ratio school, and like, you know, how to deal with that. And I was very responsible. You know, I did not go wild at all. But I would tell that 17-year-old girl to respect themselves and show that respect for themselves, and stand up for themselves and feel confident that they can make and that they are making meaningful contributions to a place like Princeton. Their lived experience is their lived experience, and nobody else has had that exact same experience. And so to talk about to talk about your experience, to relate to others' experiences in class, to what is that, compare and contrast, to be involved in the campus life. You know, as they say, and it is so true, 50% of learning happens outside the classroom in college. So get involved, you know, travel with your friends. I would tell them, take courses outside of your, outside of the norm. If I could go back to Princeton, I would take many more art history classes, comparative religion, maybe, you know, sculpture, photography, some kind of an art hands-on class. And I would tell them that when they get out, they need to pay it back, pay it on. The opportunities that have been presented to them and that they've created and that their families have tried to create for them, those are all opportunities that we as a Latino family, as a Latino population, we as the United States, we as members of the, you know, the world, will only be enriched by those young folks passing on, giving back to the community. And I did the teacher preparation program at Princeton. And although I did not become a teacher, I have been a lifelong, well, okay, since graduating, even while I was in law school, I was involved in tutoring. And so I've always been involved in advocating and working with organizations, volunteering with organizations, being on the boards of nonprofits that are all about education equity. So for me, my way of giving back has been not just in my profession and you know, having served in the city attorney's office for almost 40 years and, you know, having done the whole gambit of what the second largest municipal law firm experience is all about. I've always been involved in nonprofits, professional as well as social service. I think it's super important, and it's exactly what Princeton's motto is. So that's that. So I have to tell you my final parting story, which I guarantee you there is probably no student in Princeton's history that has ever had this experience or similar experience. So as I've told you, I grew up in a rural area. We always had a garden. We always, we ourselves, well, we had a goat and we had a Shetland pony, but my grandparents always had sheep, cattle, chickens. And it was always a tradition. You don't go to the grocery store to buy steak, you know, to buy hamburger. You've, you know, bought a steer or maybe shared buying a steer with another family. It gets butchered and it goes in your chest freezer and you have, you know, meat forever and ever. So I was really not used to ever going to a grocery store and having to buy meat. And if by chance I had to, growing up, go to a grocery store to buy meat because maybe my mom had forgotten to take the pork chops out of the freezer in time, we would just go to our local little we didn't call them bodegas. They were just, it was Tito's market. And Senor Tito, I would go, and he'd know exactly what my mom would want, how many pork chops, what thickness she would need, for dinner. And so when I got to Princeton, and I think it was my sophomore year, I was in Middle Dodd, and they had kitchens on every floor. So there was a shared kitchen by floor, or maybe it was every other floor. And I was dying to cook for myself. And there was a exchange student from Vietnam who also could not stand American food, so she cooked a lot. Vietnamese chilies are hotter than any chilies I've ever eaten in the Southwest or Mexico, as we traveled through Mexico as a child. But anyway, so I craved having really good meat that I could cook. And so my first trip home, which probably at that time we used to have fall break or election break, I think it was called. They actually would let us take a week off to go home and vote and to work on elections. And so that first, or maybe it was my freshman year at winter break, I had brought back frozen meat, wrapped it up really, really thickly in newspapers, Ziplocs, and brought it back. Probably had brought back steaks and pork chops and maybe some lamb chops. No big deal, did my cooking. And I'm pretty sure it was sophomore year. I love liver and onions. Not a whole lot of people do. I had no idea how to buy liver and onions. So my mom, on one of my trips home, which is probably winter break, she says, well, we have liver in the freezer. Why don't you take it? So I wrap up the liver, and, it always stayed solidly frozen. The meat always stayed solidly frozen all the way to getting on campus. In those days, you could fly student standby, and that meant you paid 1/3 of the normal airfare, but you were flying standby, so you were subject to getting kicked off along the route. So that particular route took me from Albuquerque to Chicago, and then had to change planes in Chicago to go to Newark. So I got bumped off in Chicago, had to stay overnight in Chicago, but my luggage went on all the way to Newark. So when I made it to Newark the following morning, go and pick up my suitcase at the, that where behind the railing where they keep suitcases that haven't been retrieved, or the large items. And I pick up my suitcase, and I'm walking over to catch either the bus or the train. I think I was taking the bus to Princeton, and a airport security guard calls me from the back, and he basically says, "Excuse me, miss, need to talk to you." And I'm like, what did I do? What? He says, "Ma'am, let me have your suitcase." And I gave him my suitcase, and I'm like totally looking at him. And you're supposed to look at a police officer in there, look at them, show respect. And he drags my takes my suitcase over to a counter, and when he lifts the suitcase up, I notice that blood is dripping from the suitcase. And I didn't really snap right away. I didn't think about it. So he says, may we open, we're going to open your suitcase. They didn't even ask. And I said, oh. Before he opened the suitcase, I explained to him that I had brought frozen liver from New Mexico, and because my suitcase had been sitting at Newark Airport overnight, it probably had thawed out, and that's what was bleeding. And he literally looked at me and he said, "Yeah, what's your other story? What else do you want to tell me?" And I'm thinking in my mind, this is New Jersey. I've seen stories about the mafia where they chop up people and they get dumped in places in New Jersey. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this guard thinks I have like dead body parts in my suitcase. Ultimately, he opens it up, and it's, it's all packaged in butcher paper, and it's got my mom or my dad's name on it. It's got John Gonzalez or Juan Gonzalez, and it's got checked off on the list of what's in the package. It says, beef liver. And he accepts the story. He calls over like the whole group of guards that are working at TWA, baggage claim, and he tells them the whole story. And so I have to figure out how to drain it all, wrap it up in paper towels in the restroom at Newark Airport, put it back in the Ziploc, and make it all the way to Princeton without my luggage continuing to drip. And unfortunately, some of my clothes got blood on it. So now I have to explain why I'm in the dorm laundry area, laundering bloody clothes from my suitcase. Anyway, that is an experience that is, I think only if you come from a rural area, a farming community, you know, a lower middle class community that you know cans and hunts and freezes their food so that they can make ends meet. But it's also part of you know, just the experience of going away from home. I don't think I would have ever had that experience had I gone to UNM or New Mexico Tech. Anyway, if there aren't any other questions, it's been absolutely, absolutely lovely. But I do have to say one more thing. Roommates, even though my freshman and sophomore year roommates, I'm not in contact with other than like during reunions. But my junior and senior year roommates, we are lifelong friends. We see each other whenever I'm on the East Coast or when I'm in San Francisco. Dolores Chavez is in Albuquerque. We get together every time I'm in New Mexico. I can't say enough about the lifelong friends, and not just the roommates, but other Latinos on campus. And then also through the alumni community, both non-Latino and Latino, but especially through ALPA, the relationships I've made through ALPA have enriched my more recent life after Princeton. Thank you. Thank you.